Our film screening this week is a movie that is considered one of the greatest classics of the classical Hollywood period of American movie history, and that is Citizen Kane, made in 1941 and directed by a director named Orson Welles. Orson Welles was a towering figure in American cinema from 1941, when Citizen Kane was made, until uh, the 1960s, and his legend even lasting longer than that. But one of the things that's most remarkable about the movie Citizen Kane is that Welles was only 25 years old when he directed the movie. So he was very, very young, and at that time had already, at age 25, had a pretty successful career for several years in radio and in theater. In the 1930s and 1940s, there were a lot of dramatic programs, plays, and other sorts of dramatic programs that appeared on the radio in the United States. And Welles was very active in the late 1930s in American radio drama, as well as stage drama, in terms of doing a lot of different sorts of plays related to Shakespeare, interpretations of Shakespeare, as well as other things. Citizen Kane was his first movie as a director, so that is yet another thing that makes it fairly remarkable in terms of cinema history, to have a first feature film by a director be something as accomplished and something as narratively and stylistically developed as Citizen Kane was. Welles acted in the film as well. He plays the main character, called Charles Foster Kane, the Citizen Kane of the title, and plays him from the age of 25, which was Welles' real age, to the age at the time of the character's death, which is approximately age 70. Now, this character, Charles Foster Kane, is loosely based on the life of a real newspaper tycoon named William Randolph Hearst. Hearst was a very powerful and prominent figure in American media from about the 1890s through the 1940s, and the character that Welles portrays and created in Citizen Kane is supposed to have been loosely based on Hearst. A lot of the details of Kane's life were modeled after details from the life of Hearst. One of the things that marks Citizen Kane is a great many innovations in film style. And it really is sort of ahead of its time in these respects. You will see a great many uses of things like deep focus and other stylistic techniques that were not particularly common or characteristic of classical Hollywood movies. And there's a lot of innovations in terms of the film narrative as well, which I'll review a little bit after saying a few more things about the movie itself. Welles, pictured here in the upper left, as I said, plays the main character, the title character of the movie, Charles Foster Kane. Joseph Cotton, pictured in the upper right, plays Jed Leland, who is Kane's best friend, who he has a falling out with over the course of the movie, and sort of becomes an enemy almost of Kane. Everett Sloan, pictured in the lower left, plays Bernstein, who is Kane's manager, sort of his business manager through the many different things that Kane gets involved in. And then finally, in terms of the characters pictured here, in the lower right is Dorothy Cummingore, who plays Susan Alexander Kane, which is the second of Charles Foster Kane's two wives that we see in the movie, and who forms one of the main characters in terms of telling the story of Charles Foster Kane. The movie the narrative of the movie is basically the biography of Charles Foster Kane. Kane became rich at a very young age, at about the age of 10, which we see portrayed in the movie. And the movie, as it unfolds, sort of shows how this fortune that makes Kane one of the richest people in the world affects the course of his life and the relationships that he has over the course of his life, in terms of his marriages, in terms of his friendships, in terms of his business relationships, and so forth. The way that the narrative is structured and the main way in which it's innovative is that it consists of a series of flashbacks. The very first thing that we see in the movie is the death of Charles Foster Kane. And in his dying words, he leaves a little bit of a mystery that is then attempting to be solved. There's a reporter who goes around and interviews people who knew Kane well, such as the other three characters on the previous slide, Jed Leland and Bernstein and Susan Alexander Kane. And this reporter interviews these characters, and each of those interviews becomes a flashback, a lengthy flashback, in which that character who knew Kane tells about the things that they experienced with Charles Foster Kane. And that's how we learn about Kane's life, is through these recollections and these flashbacks by these few characters that knew Kane well and were supposedly close to him. One of the things that precedes those flashbacks is a mock newsreel. You may or may not be familiar with what a newsreel is. In the 1930s and 1940s, prior to when television emerged, people would watch in the movie theater prior to the feature films that they watched. There would be newsreels that played, which would be sort of news updates about different things that were happening around the country. Sometimes about prominent figures, sometimes about news stories that were ongoing, sometimes human interest sorts of things. And at the beginning of Citizen Kane, we get a mock newsreel that sort of gives us a little framework or the basic overview of Kane's life, and provides sort of a timeline or an understanding, a chronology of what Kane's life is, that is then followed by these 4 flashback segments by the people who knew Charles Foster Kane. In addition to Leland and Bernstein and his second wife Susan, the 4th flashback is by another character that is the childhood guardian of Charles Foster Kane, who sort of took over the management of his fortune immediately upon Kane becoming very rich at the age of 10. So what you should watch for in Citizen Kane is how the plot presents the events of the story. Now, this movie is a great example, and that's the reason why I have people watch it for this class, in terms of the distinctions between the concepts of plot and story. The plot unfolds in a fashion that is not chronological. It sort of jumps all over the place with the different flashbacks that are portrayed. And so we as viewers have to sort of reconstruct the story in chronological order as far as what the course of Charles Foster Kane's life was. And so watch closely how the plot does this and how you, as the viewer, are able to sort of figure out what the chronology is of the events of Kane's life. Characters is another thing that we're studying this week, and so watch for the dynamics of the characters in the story, in the film. The main character, of course, being Kane, the supporting characters being those characters that are providing these flashbacks, and then there are a few characters over the course of the movie that appear just in one scene or just in maybe a couple of scenes that are bit characters that are sometimes fulfill important functions or important roles in the character relationships and in the story of Kane's life. Pay attention to film style as well. We are now into our unit on film narrative, but we do want to still pay attention to elements of film style and try and integrate them into our understandings of film narrative. So watch for deep focus, especially. We learned a little bit about that in terms of cinematography. Citizen Kane is a movie that portrays a great deal of deep focus shots where everything from the foreground into the background of the image is in focus. And sometimes different things compete for our attention within the composition of the frame. Pay attention to the elements of mise en scène. The action in the movie takes place over a broad period of time from uh, Colorado in the 1870s to New York City and Chicago in the 1890s through the 1930s. So pay attention to all of the different elements of mise en scène, the spaces in which the action takes place, the costumes, the lighting, etc. Pay attention to the sound. There's some interesting uses of music in the film, a couple of songs that are prominent, sound effects, of course, and then the dialogue as well. And then do some thinking after and maybe during your watching of the movie about what the themes of Citizen Kane are. There are some very powerful themes that can emerge from this movie in terms of what are the meanings of his life and the things that he experiences. How do these things that Charles Foster Kane experiences in the way that his life unfolds, what do these mean for the way in which human relationships um, relate to one another, people relating to one another, the role of money in a person's life, especially in a person's life where there's as much money and fortune as Charles Foster Kane experienced. So try and watch for these and see how different themes like this emerge out of the use of film narrative and film style in Orson Welles' Citizen Kane.